It took about a week for us to get scheduled to leave this rock and head back to the fleet that was surveying the entire cosmos. However, we did take that time to help my niece start to fully understand her abilities, and thankfully she began to understand them much better. It wasn't just her, but others who were having difficulties with new forms. We helped them out. In some cases, it was very simple as they didn't understand the magic they had, and we simply had to let them know, hey, you have a different style than I do. It's like trying to learn karate when you're learning from a kickboxer. They wouldn't know. If that's all they know is one style, they're going to be confused with the other. It's unbelievably simple when it comes down to it. That being said, I was grateful that Cassie was there, as many of these ones who were changed were, well, girls, and they are much more receptive to another female. Although the fact that she can use dark energy didn't hurt the matter, because we could show them the difference between the light side energy that I had and her darker energy. Yeah, I know I used that reference, but I have trouble finding something else that would fit better. See, my abilities I've shaped more towards healing than to attack, and hers, because of her genetics, are more darker in a way. At least she's not using blood magic. If she was, I wouldn't let her anywhere near me. Lord knows the type of parts I'd be missing when I wake up in the morning. Regardless of that fact, we eventually got on the shuttle, and even with the few of us who were magic users trying to pump up the engines, it would still take several weeks for us to get to the fleet. And in that time, we kept getting reports of what was happening, and what we were hearing just absolutely astounded us. As it turns out, the fleet had to jump several sectors to get away from them damn snake lady people, whatever in the hell they were. And those snakes followed them relentlessly. It seemed like once they got a taste for human, even a little part of human, didn't matter what part it was, they became absolutely voracious and would wait for any type of straggler to separate from the main group. They became severe predators, so their entire sectors became exclusionary zones. We wouldn't trade with them at all. We wouldn't even contact them. Delegation groups looked and said, "Oh, hell no. You don't have enough power to force me to go in there. Not a chance." As soon as the video surfaced of what those snake ladies and other folks did, and I keep saying ladies because they actually produce more females than they do males. It's just part of their genetics. It's about a 2-to-1 ratio, so it's much more common to see females than males. That being all said, before we could even reach the fleet, the next sector and the next species that we found staggered the hell out of me. I was not expecting this. Even though Cassie told me this is what they were going to run into next, I just couldn't believe it. I told her I'd have to see it. Sure enough, when they showed up, there was different manufactured vessels, but they almost looked like asteroids. It was just strange. You would think these were part of their moon or something like that, if it wasn't for the fact that magic was actually pushing them around. When they finally got a hold of any type of communications, we found out that technology doesn't work. You had to get a hold of them through telepathy. They were dragons. It was a dragon-based race. We couldn't believe what the hell we were seeing. It was like being out of one of those old movies from back in the day where the dragon would talk to you. The only difference is these dragons were not 3 times the size of a city bus. No. They were about, I'd say, the size of a Clydesdale was the biggest ones. That's not counting the tail, of course, or the wings. Yes, they have wings, and they reached out very far. As it turns out, dragons don't need magic to fly in atmosphere. They simply glide along like anything else. Flap their wings a few times just to get themselves going, and the tail is mainly for walking, because they don't just walk on all fours. No, even though they have 4 limbs outside of their wings and tail, they prefer to walk on their hind legs and stand up straight. This tends to make them loom over us, and it was actually a funny picture to see the delegation walk up and try to shake the hands of something that stood about 15 feet tall. And just looking up, and the dragon lowered its head down as far as it could to try and look the human in the eye, and I swear I could see a little bit of a smile on that face. What we found out very quickly is dragons are very subdued, excessively powerful, as we found out when a few of the guys went down to the planet. They would see a few dragons actually fighting. The dragon fire, if you want to call it that, was not fire like we would think, but more of a shiny blue, almost electric color. It was enough that when it landed, we could actually see whole hillsides began to take extreme amounts of damage. Just with a few calculations, we could find out that that dragon fire would cut into this shuttle that I'm in and cut it stem to stern. It was just absolutely crazy when you think about it. That being said, it's not just that they're very subdued as a group, but they have everything they want. They're a type of species that wants for nothing. Every time they wake up from their slumber, they eat, drink, screw, and that's about it. Then they go back to sleep. And sometimes they'll sleep for years, if not decades. The delegation was brought to their leader, and the leader had to be woken up. However, when you wake up a dragon, step back. These things get very, very, very mean when you wake them up, as in extremely mean and agitated, as they snapped at the delegation, almost eating one of them. It was kind of interesting to see that one of our delegates almost shit his pants at the fact that this lizard that was twice his size just about, bit his head off. That being said, it was very surprising to see that the dragons had no interest in any of our politics or even starting to share. As I stated before, they want for nothing. They do eat a lot, but the most they do is trade a little bit of the resources on their planet with the dwarves, or trade a little bit of their power over with the elves so that they can maintain their own peace. It wasn't long before the delegation found a way to just coexist, as they were given free passage through this dragon territory. At least we call it dragon territory. The actual name is very difficult, if impossible, to pronounce by human terms, because it's more like a roar to our ears than anything else. Thankfully, our translators were able to do what they do. The tieflings that were with us actually helped a lot in that aspect. They became middle ground personnel, and that's one of the reasons why Cassie stuck around. Well, that and the fact that, again, we had started to get close. All in all, it was surprising to realize I would not have to run and just immediately start healing people like I had before. However, we found out one small issue, is that the youngest of the dragons were not nearly as, shall we say, slothful as the adults were. The adults, seemingly as soon as they experienced the little bit that life had to give them, eating a decent meal, drinking some good drink, getting a little schnook on the side, and they just wanted to sleep. They were very, very slow moving, unless they wanted to move. There was an issue with a couple of the small ones that wanted to go out and explore. However, they did have an issue with our magic, and that being every time we used our magic to jump in and out of their sector, they could tell. They said it was like somebody shook them at night. Mentally, that was. Almost like somebody called out, as if you heard somebody screaming in the apartment down the hall. It would just kind of disturb their slumber a little bit. But with a little convincing, we told them it wouldn't be too much of a problem. By the time I reached that area, the convoy had finally started to move out of the dragon sectors, which was 5 sectors long, which was very large, especially since they didn't want to move much. They only expanded once every few hundred years, if that. So it was very easy for us to find our way across. Upon reaching the main group, I was introduced to one of these young dragons that was very, very interested, didn't want to sleep, just wanted to play, and was very interested to see how a magic user like myself would be able to operate. She actually thought it'd be funny to try and test her dragon fire against me, and I had to remind her we're inside a ship floating in the vacuum of space. You want to do this? You want to do something stupid? We can just open up the cargo bay that you're sleeping in, and you can vent out inside the space. I'd rather not destroy this entire ship because you're bored." The dragon simply looked at me, kind of had to lower its head a little bit, and unfortunately was kind of pissed off that she couldn't go into the entire ship. However, Cassie had an idea, something I really didn't even think was possible. Now, I had read the old ancient stories about transmutation and transmogrification, if I'm saying that right, but I didn't think that we could actually pull it off. I could think that the amount of energy I would need just to heal somebody who had lost a limb or two was so draining. I was wondering if I could do this to a dragon. I mean, that's a big change. That's going to put me into a coma. Although Cassie told me that it was possible as long as more than one person is doing it. However, this was really up to the consideration of our dragon friend herself. Turned out we had to give her a more human name because, again, we could not pronounce it. So Talina was the name we gave her, which is as close as we could get with a human tongue to the way her name was pronounced. Talina mulled over it for several days and then eventually stated that, yes, she wanted to change. However, I had to warn her that given the amount of energy and the changes done, she might not be able to change back. If this was true, she may never find a dragon mate because they might not find her attractive anymore. This put her back, and she decided to sit and talk with Cassie in private for a while. I have no idea what the hell they talked about. However, after another day, Talina said that she was willing to do so. And this we had to do on planet. We could not do this inside a ship. So it was decided that we would do the transformation once we actually went to the next sector and found a planet we could set down on. This did not go over with Talia very well, as she was getting very antsy. Since she couldn't travel throughout most of the ship, she was stuck inside some of the cargo bays for the entire duration. And let's just say, for a young one, you can get a little stir-crazy. However, when we reached the next sector, we found that the actual sector was abandoned. There was nothing there. Nothing at all, really. And the fact of the matter is, except for the star and 2 planets, there was nothing. And unfortunately, there was no planet that we could set down on with a breathable atmosphere that we would be able to do the transmogrification and be able to do it successfully without killing ourselves. So we had to move on. This was driving Talia crazy. She, if nothing else, she just wanted to fly for a little bit and quite literally stretch her wings, which I could understand. Again, she's young. Then she finally reached a planet that we could set down on. A planet, again, in an empty sector. And we set down on that planet after a few days of the recon teams going through. The recon teams were actually surprised that a planet that had a breathable atmosphere had so little foliage. It was strange. It was almost like if you've seen Ireland, where very little foliage grows. A lot of rock outcroppings and a lot of rolling hills, some mountains off in the distance, but no large trees or anything like that. When we got to the ground, I was again amazed that we could breathe. However, the air was a little thin, at least thinner than what I was used to. This was enough, though, to allow Talia to at least fly around a little bit. She wanted to reach out and she wanted to stretch. She wanted to actually burn some energy. Freaking kids. But eventually, she came back down. Cassie and I, with a few other magic users, were getting ready to do what we had to do to get the transformation done. But we confirmed with Cassie again. We stayed out all night. And thankfully, I didn't need a lighter to start any type of fire, as Talia just kind of, spit a fireball into it. Seriously, it looked like Super Mario Bros. Boop! Just hocked a patooey in there, and poof, we had a fire. The next morning, after everyone got a good night's rest, we got ready to change Talia. Talia was a little apprehensive, but still willing to go through with it. What I was not expecting is what happened. With the mixture of my magic, along with other magic wielders like myself, and Cassie, and a few other tieflings, we were just amazed at the different colors and variations that came around in a strange orb around Talina as her body was elevated off the ground. She seemed to lose consciousness, part of it. As she came through, her eyes began to roll back into her head as her body was lifted up. It was almost as though her body looked like it was inside an egg again. It was very strange, although I did have to laugh at this idea since dragons give birth to live young. When the powers began to manifest around and elevate, it began to glow very bright. Many of the non-magic wielders were shielding their eyes. I had to use a little bit of magic to actually cover my eyes a little bit. And then I realized, hey, they gave me a cloak for a reason. And I realized this was the reason back in the day when magic wielders were back on Earth, that they wore cloaks to protect their eyes from the insane amount of power. Basically, you're looking inside a nuclear reactor at this point. Cassie had to almost shield her eyes with her free hand, as she kept her eyes closed for most of what we were doing. We forced our energy into Talina, and there was no reaction, no resistance either. She simply accepted the changes that were going to happen. We had to ask her to state what she wanted to look like, how she wanted to change. She looked over at Cassie and said, "I want to look like her," as Talina raised one of her talons and slowly pointed in that direction. I could barely see it through all the color variations and the swirling of energy around her. And one of the other magic wielders simply stated, "Then so be it." And with that, we all put our energy on high. The draining of power that it took was that of running a 10-mile marathon at your 90% speed the entire way. By the time the transformation was complete, I was about ready to drop to one knee and puke. I was just so exhausted. Everyone else was breathing extremely heavy, and even Cassie fell down on her butt, actually landing on her tail and saying ouch because she landed sideways. When we went up to see our work, Talina was standing there, at least for a moment, and then she collapsed to the ground. We ran up to see what was going on, and we could see that she was, in fact, what we used to call a dragonborn. She still had her horns. She did look a lot like Cassie at that point. She had a tail, but it was much, much wider, much more muscular than Cassie's. And the main difference was Talina retained her wings. Though her wings were not nearly as large, as she did not need massive wings to fly anymore. Her wings had moved slightly, maybe about one vertebrae, as, well, dragons are more set in the center because the way their bodies are designed, the weight is distributed. Now that she had more of a bipedal humanoid look, and as a female, her wings went farther down her back. Yes, I know where most people's minds go to this, and yes, succubus do have their wings that low too. Mainly because, again, for them to fly, they must balance their weight. And women do not carry the weight in their shoulders like men do. Keep that in mind. When Talina finally raised her head, she looked up at us. I got down to one knee and I held out my hand. Cassie was walking up beside me as Talina looked at her hands and closed them and opened them, closed them and opened them, realizing to herself that this was her new body. She looked down and began to feel all over. I turned my head a little bit in a little sense of modesty, and thankfully Cassie had thought about this and had brought up a blanket and put it around Talina. Talina actually took it, tossed it off, and said, "Why'd you do that?" as she stood up, showing her new form. And then I realized, oh shit, Talina is young. To my human eyes, she didn't look more than about 11 to 12 years old. And I was just like, oh, son of a bitch. Now I feel like the dirty old man. Regardless of that, we had to tell her that modesty was a little bit of a thing. Cassie reminded her to cover herself, but before that even took place, Talia raised her wings and flapped as hard as she could, and she actually left the ground. Using a little bit of her own dragon fire that she maintained as she hacked it towards the ground to give her just a little bit of a boost, she took flight. She flew around like some little angel with reptilian wings. She used her tail just as she always did, but she had a little bit of trouble with her hind legs as she had to actually extend them now that she's human. When she was a dragon, she would tuck them up underneath. We had to scream this up to her as she was having a lot of trouble staying stable. However, once she fully extended her body and brought her arms flat against her sides, she realized that she could fly very easily as she was used to this at her old form. When she finally landed, Cassie had got her some actual clothes to wear out of her own wardrobe. Unfortunately, Cassie was a little bit more mature, so they didn't quite fit well, and I used a little bit of my own power to alter the clothing a little bit so it fit better. Although I really wish there was a little bit more of that, I had to tell Cassie that tiefling wardrobes are very elegant but a little sparser than I'm used to. She did look at me strange on this, but we have had that conversation before. It was not long before word of this got back to the dragons, of course, and a sort of video feed. It's not quite video, however, it is a magic and it will allow them to see each other. The dragons, especially Talia's parents, were not happy with the transformation. They were angry at us, very angry, and told them in the delegation that they could not even come close unless they returned their daughter to her original form, and yet her daughter kept saying, but I like this form. It's not like it was surgery, of course. It's not like we had to, readjust things. It wasn't like we were changing her all that much. And we told them that if we were to change her back, she might not be fully dragon anymore anyway. She asked for this. They were still angry. It wasn't until a few of our ships decided to land on one of the dragon planets that we realized how angry they were. They realized that we were coming as our engines woke them up. And not only were they pissed on that, but they came at our delegation. No survivors. In fact, the ships themselves didn't even make it, as the dragons would get on and use their massive talons to just rip through the bulkheads like we would rip through wet cardboard. It was just insane to see. The videos were sent up, and I did get a chance to see them. I realized how truly dangerous the dragons were, and we tried to get Talia to at least agree to go back and plead her case, but she didn't want to go. Kids. And shockingly, she was not the only dragon who wanted to, especially dragon pups. If they were young ones, they were more apt to do this. Only one single dragon who was an adult wanted to be changed to be more human, to be able to travel the stars in something other than their asteroid-shaped ships, which were basically giant caves in space. So basically, it was like being back in their own dens all the time as they traveled the stars, using magic to push themselves from one sector to another and sleeping the entire duration until they got to where they were supposed to go. The one single dragon who wanted to be changed was an adult male, and I looked at him and he was at least in his mid-20s, at least when we changed him. That's what he looked like. He still had the typical horns that came out. He still had his tail. He still had his wings. But he insisted on keeping much more of his muscular definition. This was surprising because most dragons don't have muscular definition. They spend too much time asleep to actually build up any definition. If it wasn't for the fact they had to wake up just to eat, their muscles would atrophy to the point of complete insanity. However, I was actually glad to at least have one male dragonborn around, somewhere closer to my age, as having all these young ones around was getting to be difficult. Thankfully, Cassie was much more attuned to dealing with young ones like this, and not to mention dealing with young females, not my area of expertise. My area of expertise was usually training young men. So, yeah, I was grateful for her help. And grateful for the fact that the Dragonborns who were changed to human seemed to shake off a lot of their old ways. They didn't want to sleep the whole time. Don't get me wrong, when they slept hard. You basically had to slap them across the face to wake them up. Which, by the way, don't do that. Not that they're going to snap at you, but their skulls are so damn dense you'll break your fucking hand. Did that once. Ouch. Good thing for magic, I could put myself back together. That being said, by the time we got everyone transformed, and thankfully we could still travel through the dragon space, but we weren't allowed to land on any of their planets, they were more concerned that more of their numbers would go away from their old ways and no longer want to be full-blood dragons anymore. I mean, truthfully, I could see that, considering what happened about half a sector later when we were in transit. Several of the humans that were with us that didn't have any magic wanted to become dragons. I didn't understand why. Thankfully, it's no one I was related to, but we did end up on a planet and we did transform them ourselves. The problem is the transformation will change you. Well, let me phrase it right. They will adjust you, but it will not fully change you. So when we did change them into actual dragons, there was some obvious changes. The shorter legs of dragons were, well, they weren't so short anymore. And the fact that their necks were not nearly as long, I mean, they were still elongated, but still. And along with the fact that the horns were not nearly as accentuated, but it didn't matter so much. In all honesty, it just seemed like they were more, by dragons' perspective, they were just a bit more feminine. That's all. That being said, we did end up dropping them off on one of the dragon's worlds and trying to placate them to say, look, we still have people who want to add blood into your ranks. They were still not happy, although it seemed to calm them down enough that we could still travel through their space without worrying about them launching one of their giant space rocks our way. As strong as our weapons are, there's only so much debris we can shoot away before we definitely have to run like hell. But that's a story for another time. Eventually, we would go into a section that did not have dragons. And this was a section that made my wonderful Cassie very, very nervous. Because the species we found there, with their little ships that seemed to buzz around us like crazy, almost like gnats, was something I was not expecting. And what we found down there, I don't know if I can consider it heaven or hell. I will say, when we found out who, or I should say what, we were going to deal with next, and was given a description, I had to look at Cassie and say, are you fucking kidding me?